Welcome to this special audio series, where we explore the lives of 12 individuals who have faced the profound challenge of depression. These are not just stories of struggle, they are stories of resilience, vulnerability, and hope. Depression can often feel isolating, but it's a journey that so many experience in silence. As you listen, we invite you to approach these stories with an open heart and mind. Whether you've faced similar challenges, know someone who has, or are simply here to learn, these voices have something meaningful to share. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The Light in the Darkness, Maya. The sun was already high in the sky when Maya woke up. The faint rays that filtered through her sheer curtains illuminated the chaos of her apartment, a sea of crumpled papers, half-empty coffee mugs, and a laptop whose screen glowed faintly in sleep mode. She groaned, pulling the blanket over her head. It was another day, another struggle. Maya had always dreamed of freelancing, of being her own boss and working on her own terms. She imagined sunny mornings filled with yoga and leisurely breakfasts, afternoons spent working in cafes, and evenings free for hobbies or socializing. But the reality was far from the dream. The weight of expectations. At 29, Maya was a freelance copywriter specializing in content for tech startups. It was a niche she had carved out during her corporate days before quitting the 9-to-5 grind 3 years ago. While the initial months felt liberating, the novelty had worn off quickly. Now, the flexibility she once craved seemed to be a double-edged sword. Her mornings were rarely productive. Most days, she stayed in bed until guilt dragged her to her desk. She worked from home, if you could call her cluttered living room home office, and often struggled to meet deadlines. The pressure of delivering high-quality work, chasing clients for payments, and constantly pitching for new gigs weighed heavily on her. But it wasn't just work. For as long as she could remember, Maya had been wrestling with depression. It was a shadow that followed her everywhere, amplifying her insecurities and making even the smallest tasks feel monumental. A vicious cycle. Maya's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Reluctantly, she picked it up and saw a notification from Sarah, her best friend. "Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Wanna grab lunch this week?" She stared at the message for a full minute before locking the phone without replying. It wasn't that she didn't want to see Sarah, it was just that the effort of putting on a happy face felt overwhelming. Instead, she dragged herself out of bed and into the kitchen. The sink was piled high with dishes she had promised herself to clean yesterday. She ignored them, grabbing a granola bar and a lukewarm cup of coffee from the counter. By the time she settled at her desk, it was already noon. Maya opened her laptop and stared at her to-do list. 1. Finish blog post for TechFlow Solutions. 2. Draft pitch for new client. 3. Follow up on unpaid invoices. The first task alone felt insurmountable. Writing required creativity, and creativity required energy, something she was perpetually short of these days. Hours passed, and Maya found herself scrolling through social media instead of working. She knew the algorithm-fed highlight reels of other people's lives were a trap, but she couldn't stop. Her feed was filled with friends getting promotions, traveling the world, or celebrating milestones. It was hard not to compare. Why can't I be like them? She thought bitterly. A moment of clarity. By 6 p.m., Maya had barely made a dent in her tasks. Frustrated, she shut her laptop and slumped on the couch. Her chest felt heavy, her thoughts spiraling into a familiar dark place. She thought about quitting. Maybe freelancing wasn't for her. Maybe she wasn't cut out for anything. The idea of going back to a corporate job was unappealing, but so was this constant battle with herself. Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of her thoughts became unbearable. It wasn't the first time she had felt like this, but every time it happened, it felt just as crushing. It was then that her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email notification. "Your article on AI trends was featured as a top read this week." For a moment, Maya's despair lifted. She clicked on the link and saw her work prominently displayed on a popular industry website. The comments section was filled with praise for her insights and writing style. A faint smile crossed her lips. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Seeking help. That night, as she lay in bed, Maya thought about the fleeting moment of pride she had felt earlier. It reminded her that she was capable, even if her mind often convinced her otherwise. The next morning, she did something she had been avoiding for months. She booked an appointment with a therapist. The first session was hard. Talking about her feelings felt like peeling back layers of armor she had spent years constructing. But as the weeks went by, therapy became a lifeline. Her therapist helped her recognize the patterns in her thinking that perpetuated her depression. They worked on setting boundaries, both with clients and herself, and establishing a routine. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when Maya started journaling. It became a safe space for her to process her emotions and reflect on her accomplishments, no matter how small. Rebuilding. With time, Maya learned to manage her depression better. She still had bad days when getting out of bed felt impossible or when work piled up because her mind couldn't focus. But she stopped punishing herself for it. She also made changes to her freelance routine. She started her mornings with a short walk or yoga session, even if she didn't feel like it. She found that moving her body helped clear her mind. Maya also created a dedicated workspace in her apartment. It was nothing fancy, a small desk by the window with a comfortable chair, but it helped her separate work from the rest of her life. She even reconnected with Sarah, explaining her struggles and how they sometimes made her withdraw. To her relief, Sarah was understanding and supportive. A new chapter. A year later, Maya's life wasn't perfect, but it was better. She had built a steady stream of clients and even started collaborating with other freelancers on larger projects. More importantly, she had learned to be kinder to herself. She no longer saw her depression as a personal failing but as a part of her she could live with and manage. On a sunny afternoon, as Maya sat at her desk finishing a project, she glanced out the window. The city was bustling below, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't fixed, but she was healing. And that was enough. Chapter 2: The Invisible Weight, Ryan. Ryan stepped out of the rideshare car, the bright, modern facade of his office building towering before him. With his tailored suit and polished shoes, he looked every bit the successful entrepreneur. He nodded at the doorman, mustered a confident smile for the receptionist, and strode toward the elevator. To everyone else, Ryan was living the dream. At 34, he had built a thriving tech startup, Innovatech, that provided custom AI solutions for small businesses. His company had grown rapidly, securing funding rounds and media attention. Yet, behind the carefully curated facade of success, Ryan was struggling with an adversary far more daunting than market competition: depression. The beginning of the descent. Depression didn't come for Ryan all at once. It crept in slowly, camouflaged as stress and exhaustion. In the early days of his startup, Ryan had thrived on adrenaline, pulling all-nighters and chasing ambitious goals. But once the company stabilized and grew, he found himself grappling with a profound emptiness. The very work that had once fueled his passion now felt like an endless, monotonous grind. Even the milestones, closing a major deal, being featured in Forbes, hiring a talented team, brought only fleeting satisfaction. Ryan ignored the signs at first. He chalked up his lack of enthusiasm to burnout and convinced himself he just needed a vacation. But no matter how many trips he took, how many books on mindfulness he read, or how many hours he spent at the gym, the heaviness in his chest remained. A hollow success. On this particular Monday morning, Ryan entered his corner office and sank into his ergonomic chair. His desk was immaculate, as always. He opened his laptop to check emails, but his eyes drifted to the view outside. Skyscrapers loomed against the gray sky, and the distant hum of the city seemed to mock his silence. The sound of a knock jolted him. It was Melissa, his chief operating officer. "Morning, Ryan. Just a heads up, the team is ready for the weekly strategy meeting in 5 minutes." Ryan forced a smile. "Thanks, Melissa. I'll be right there." As she left, Ryan took a deep breath, dreading the meeting. While he was good at projecting energy and confidence, these moments drained him. Every smile, every pep talk felt like a performance. When he entered the conference room, his team greeted him with respect and admiration. He had handpicked them, some of the brightest minds in the industry. Yet, Ryan often felt like an imposter among them, as though his depression negated his ability to lead. The meeting dragged on. Discussions about market strategies and product updates blurred in his mind. He nodded at the right moments, masking his inner turmoil, and ended the meeting with his trademark optimism. Inside, he felt like a fraud. Alone in the crowd. That evening, Ryan attended a networking event, another obligation that had become a chore. The room buzzed with conversations and laughter, entrepreneurs and investors mingling over cocktails. Ryan stood near the bar, a drink in hand, and engaged in small talk with an investor he barely remembered. He laughed when appropriate, shared updates about Innovatech, and even pitched a few ideas. But his mind wandered. He wondered if anyone could see through his polished exterior. Did they know that most mornings, he struggled to find the motivation to get out of bed? That he sometimes sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen, overwhelmed by the simplest tasks? A colleague approached him, breaking his thoughts. "Ryan, you're killing it. Seriously, you're an inspiration." Ryan thanked him with practiced humility, but the compliment only deepened his despair. If only they knew how hollow he felt. A quiet collapse. By the time Ryan got home, the mask had become too heavy to wear. He tossed his keys on the counter and collapsed onto the couch. The quiet of his penthouse apartment was deafening. He scrolled through his phone aimlessly, his newsfeed filled with friends announcing engagements, promotions, and exotic vacations. It all felt like a cruel joke. The weight in his chest grew unbearable, his thoughts spiraling into a dark abyss. He wondered if he was fundamentally broken, incapable of happiness no matter how much he achieved. The intrusive thought struck him like a slap. Would anyone really miss me if I were gone? The realization terrified him. For the first time, he acknowledged the depth of his struggle. Seeking help. The next day, Ryan did something he had avoided for years. He called a therapist. Sitting in the therapist's office a week later, he felt out of place. The walls were lined with books, the air faintly scented with lavender. The therapist, Dr. Patel, greeted him warmly, her demeanor calm and non-judgmental. Ryan hesitated before speaking, unsure how to articulate his feelings. But as the session progressed, he found himself unloading the thoughts he had kept bottled up for years. He talked about his fears of failure, his struggle with imposter syndrome, and the crushing loneliness he felt despite his success. Dr. Patel listened intently. "Ryan, it's clear you're carrying a lot of pressure. But I want you to know that depression doesn't discriminate, it can affect anyone, regardless of their achievements. Seeking help is a courageous first step." Over the next few sessions, Ryan began to understand his depression. It wasn't a personal failing or a sign of weakness, it was a condition that required attention and care. Rebuilding. With therapy, Ryan started making small but meaningful changes. He learned to set boundaries, delegating tasks to his team instead of micromanaging everything. He began journaling his thoughts, a practice that helped him untangle his emotions. Ryan also started sharing his struggles with a few trusted friends, including Melissa. To his surprise, they didn't judge him or see him as weak. Instead, they offered support and reassured him of his worth. One evening, Melissa stopped by his office. "I just wanted to say, I've noticed a change in you lately. You seem more present, more human. It's inspiring." Ryan smiled, genuinely this time. Thanks, Melissa. It's been a journey, but I'm learning to take things one step at a time. A new perspective. Months later, Ryan stood before a packed auditorium, giving a keynote speech at a tech conference. This time, he decided to speak not just about business strategies but about his personal journey. I want to be honest with you all, he began. Entrepreneurship isn't just about innovation and profits. It's also about resilience, and not just in the face of external challenges, but internal ones as well. I've struggled with depression, even at the height of my success. It's something we don't talk about enough in our industry, but mental health is just as important as any balance sheet or product launch. Seeking help was the best decision I ever made. The audience was silent, his words sinking in. For the first time in years, Ryan felt truly seen, not as an untouchable success story, but as a human being. As the applause erupted, he realized something profound: his worth wasn't tied to his accomplishments. He was enough, just as he was. Chapter 3: The Weight of the World. Ben. Ben sat at his desk, staring blankly at the screen. The cursor blinked on an empty Word document, its rhythmic pulse a cruel reminder that he hadn't written a single word in over an hour. Outside, the city buzzed with life, cars honking, people chatting, the distant hum of construction work, but inside his small apartment, the silence was suffocating. As a freelance journalist, Ben had always found solace in storytelling. Writing had been his escape, a way to make sense of the world's chaos. But lately, even that felt like a monumental effort. His editor had sent him a clear assignment, a 2,000-word feature on how small businesses were adapting to post-pandemic challenges. Normally, he would have embraced the task, diving into interviews and research with enthusiasm. Now, he couldn't even bring himself to type a sentence. The fog. Depression wasn't new to Ben. It had lingered on the edges of his life for years, sometimes retreating, sometimes surging forward like a tidal wave. He thought he'd beaten it once, during college, when therapy and medication had helped him regain his footing. But in the past few months, the familiar weight had returned, pressing down on him like an invisible hand. It started subtly. Sleepless nights, a lack of interest in the novels he once devoured, and an ever-growing pile of dirty dishes in the sink. Soon, it became harder to get out of bed, harder to answer emails, harder to face the world. Now, every day felt like a battle. Ben's phone buzzed, breaking his trance. It was a text from his best friend, Alex. "Haven't heard from you in a bit. You okay?" Ben stared at the message for a long time before typing a half-hearted reply, "Yeah, just busy with work." It was a lie, of course. He wasn't busy, he was stuck. The breaking point. By the time evening rolled around, Ben hadn't made any progress on his article. Frustrated, he slammed his laptop shut and sank onto the couch. His chest felt heavy, like he was carrying the weight of the world. The thought hit him, unbidden, what's the point of all this? It wasn't the first time he'd felt this way, but each time it surfaced, it scared him a little more. He knew he needed help, but asking for it felt like admitting defeat. Ben scrolled through his phone, aimlessly thumbing through apps until he landed on his therapist's number. He hadn't seen her in over a year, convinced that he didn't need therapy anymore. Now, as he stared at the contact, his finger hovered over the call button. After what felt like an eternity, he pressed it. "Hi, this is Dr. Cohen's office," a calm voice answered. "Hi," Ben croaked, his voice shaky. I need to make an appointment." Small steps. The following week, Ben sat in Dr. Cohen's office. The space was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and a bookshelf lined with titles ranging from psychology textbooks to poetry anthologies. Dr. Cohen smiled gently. "It's good to see you again, Ben. What's been going on?" For a moment, Ben hesitated, unsure where to begin. Then, the words poured out, his struggles with motivation, the overwhelming sense of hopelessness, the paralyzing fear that he was failing at everything. Dr. Cohen listened intently, her expression compassionate. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot on your own," she said. Depression can be incredibly isolating, but it's important to remember that you don't have to go through this alone. Over the next few sessions, they worked together to identify the patterns contributing to Ben's depression. Dr. Cohen helped him set small, achievable goals, responding to one email, taking a short walk, writing 100 words a day. She also encouraged him to reconnect with the activities that used to bring him joy, even if they felt meaningless at first. A glimmer of light. One morning, Ben forced himself to go to a local cafe where he used to write. The familiar scent of coffee and the quiet hum of background conversations felt strangely comforting. He opened his laptop and stared at the blank document again. But this time, instead of succumbing to the pressure of perfection, he started typing just a few sentences about the first small business owner he had interviewed. The words didn't flow easily, but they came. Slowly, the feature began to take shape. By the time Ben looked up, 2 hours had passed, and he had written nearly 500 words. It wasn't much, but it was progress. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of accomplishment. Reaching out. Later that evening, Ben decided to call Alex. "Hey," Alex said, his voice warm. "It's good to hear from you. How's everything going?" Ben hesitated but then took a deep breath. "Honestly? Not great. I've been struggling a lot lately." There was a pause on the other end, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "Thanks for telling me," Alex said. "I'm really sorry you're going through this. Is there anything I can do to help?" Ben felt a lump in his throat. Just knowing you're there helps," he said. Talking to Alex didn't magically solve his problems, but it made him feel less alone. Building momentum. Over the next few weeks, Ben continued to make small strides. He wrote a little every day, even when it felt like pulling teeth. He started going for short walks in the morning, letting the crisp air clear his mind. He also began setting boundaries with work, turning down assignments that felt too overwhelming and giving himself permission to rest when needed. One day, as he wrapped up his article on small businesses, Ben felt a surge of pride. It wasn't his best work, but it was done, and that was enough. When he sent the draft to his editor, he included a brief note, "Thanks for your patience. I've been dealing with some personal challenges, but I'm working through them." To his surprise, his editor replied almost immediately, "Take all the time you need, Ben. Your health comes first. Let me know if there's anything I can do to support you." Moving forward. Ben's depression didn't vanish overnight. There were still bad days when getting out of bed felt impossible or when the weight in his chest returned. But there were also good days, moments of clarity and hope that reminded him why he had chosen this path. He learned to celebrate small victories, like finishing an article or spending time with friends. He leaned on his support system and continued therapy, recognizing that healing was a process, not a destination. One evening, as Ben sat at his desk, he opened a new document. This time, the words came a little easier. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like himself again. Chapter 4: The Long Road Back. Ethan leaned against the counter of his tiny kitchen, nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee. Outside the window, the early morning sunlight bathed the city in golden hues, but it brought no comfort to him. The day stretched ahead like a vast, featureless desert, and Ethan couldn't summon the energy to cross it. His laptop sat on the table in the adjoining living room, its screen dark and accusing. The deadline for his latest project loomed, a website overhaul for a boutique travel agency. It was work Ethan used to enjoy as a freelance web designer. He loved the creativity, the challenge of taking a client's vision and turning it into something real. But lately, the passion had evaporated, leaving him with a profound sense of emptiness. The slow decline. Ethan hadn't always felt this way. Just a year ago, he had been thriving, working with exciting clients, managing a steady flow of projects, and even mentoring other freelancers in his spare time. But then, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. At first, it was little things, an inexplicable sense of dread before meetings, a growing pile of unfinished tasks. He chalked it up to stress and told himself he just needed to work harder. But no matter how much he pushed himself, the heaviness in his chest only grew. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it was restless. He started avoiding friends, canceling plans with vague excuses. Even his favorite activities, binge-watching sci-fi shows, sketching ideas in his notebook, felt like chores. Ethan knew what was happening. He dealt with depression once before, in his early 20s, after a devastating breakup. Back then, therapy had helped him find his way out of the darkness. But now, at 31, the thought of reaching out for help felt too exhausting, too vulnerable. The breaking point. One afternoon, Ethan sat staring at a blank canvas in his web design software. The client's instructions were clear, the creative direction straightforward, yet he couldn't bring himself to start. His heart pounded in his chest, not from urgency but from a deep, unrelenting sense of failure. The email notification broke the silence. It was from his client. "Hi Ethan, just checking in. Is the homepage ready for review yet?" He felt his stomach churn. He hadn't even begun the homepage. Hands trembling, he typed out a response, running a bit behind. "I'll have it ready by tomorrow." Another lie. Ethan closed his laptop and buried his face in his hands. He felt trapped, suffocated by the demands of his work and his inability to meet them. The thought struck him with a chilling clarity, maybe they'd be better off hiring someone else. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself scrolling through his phone. His finger hovered over the contact list, stopping at the name of his old therapist, Dr. Moore. He hesitated, feeling the familiar pull of shame and doubt. But then, almost reflexively, he tapped the number. Seeking support. The first session was awkward. Sitting across from Dr. Moore in the same beige office where he'd once felt safe, Ethan struggled to articulate his thoughts. "It's just, everything feels heavy," he admitted, staring at the floor. "I can't concentrate. I can't work. It's like I'm failing at life." Dr. Moore nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you're carrying a lot on your own. Have you been able to talk to anyone about this?" "No," Ethan said quickly. "I don't want to burden anyone." "Ethan, reaching out isn't a burden. It's brave. And you've already taken the first step by coming here." Over the next few weeks, Ethan began unpacking his feelings in therapy. Dr. Moore helped him explore the perfectionism and self-criticism that often drove his depression. They talked about his fear of letting people down, his tendency to isolate, and the unrealistic expectations he placed on himself. Dr. Moore also encouraged him to set small, manageable goals. Things like taking a walk in the morning, spending 5 minutes on a design sketch, or texting a friend. Rebuilding slowly. One of the first goals Ethan set for himself was to clean his workspace. It seemed trivial, but the cluttered desk in his living room had become a visual reminder of his stagnation. One Saturday morning, he put on music and started sorting through the mess. Old receipts, empty coffee mugs, and tangled cords were thrown out or put away. By the time he finished, his desk looked inviting again, a small but satisfying victory. Encouraged by the progress, Ethan decided to tackle his overdue project. He started small, working on the client's homepage for just 15 minutes at a time. At first, the effort felt monumental, but as he sketched out ideas and began piecing elements together, the flow returned. When he finally submitted the completed homepage for review, he felt a rare flicker of pride. Reaching out. Ethan's progress wasn't linear. There were still bad days when the fog of depression settled over him like a heavy blanket. On one such day, his phone buzzed with a text from his friend Mia. "Haven't seen you in forever. Want to grab coffee this week?" His first instinct was to decline, to retreat into the safety of solitude. But something Dr. Moore had said echoed in his mind: connection is a lifeline, even when it feels like the hardest thing to do. With some hesitation, he replied, "Sure. How about Friday?" When Friday came, Ethan almost canceled, but he pushed through. Sitting across from Mia at their favorite cafe, he felt a strange mix of anxiety and relief. "I've been meaning to check in on you," Mia said. "You've seemed a bit distant lately." Ethan took a deep breath. "I've been dealing with some stuff," he admitted. "Depression, mostly." To his surprise, Mia didn't look uncomfortable or pitying. Instead, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Thanks for telling me," she said. "I'm here for you, okay?" The simple gesture left Ethan feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Finding balance. As the months passed, Ethan continued to rebuild his life. He made a habit of taking breaks during workdays, stepping outside for fresh air or stretching by his desk. He also started saying no to projects that felt overwhelming, choosing instead to focus on clients who aligned with his values. One day, he received an email from the boutique travel agency. "The new website is fantastic. Thank you for bringing our vision to life." Ethan smiled as he read the message. It wasn't just about the praise, it was about the fact that he'd completed the project despite the obstacles. That evening, Ethan opened his sketchbook for the first time in months. The blank page no longer felt intimidating, it felt like an opportunity. He began drawing, the lines flowing easily, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like himself again. Moving forward. Ethan's depression didn't disappear overnight. There were still moments of doubt, days when the weight felt unbearable. But now, he had tools to cope, a support system, a therapist, and a renewed sense of purpose. As he closed his sketchbook and looked out at the city lights, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. He was still on the journey, but he was moving forward. And that was enough. Chapter 5, Quiet Storms, Clara. Clara adjusted her glasses, blinking at the spreadsheet on her screen. The numbers swam before her eyes, and she rubbed her temples, trying to summon focus. As a financial analyst for a mid-sized consulting firm, Clara was no stranger to long hours and tight deadlines. Her job required precision, quick thinking, and resilience, qualities she once took pride in. But today, like so many others lately, she felt an all-encompassing fog. The work she used to enjoy now felt like an insurmountable mountain. Even the thought of answering an email seemed exhausting. A soft knock broke her trance. Her manager, Joel, poked his head into the small office. "Hey, Clara. Any updates on the quarterly forecast?" Clara forced a smile. "Almost done. I'll send it over by the end of the day." Joel nodded and left without pressing further. The truth was, she hadn't even started. The file was open on her desktop, untouched since the morning. She stared at the screen again, her chest tight. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine. The cracks. Clara had always been known for her reliability. She hit every deadline, often volunteering for extra work to help the team. But over the past few months, something had shifted. It started with small things, forgetting to set her alarm, struggling to concentrate during meetings. Then came the deeper changes, a lack of motivation, constant fatigue, and a nagging sense of inadequacy. No matter how much she achieved, it never felt like enough. Her colleagues hadn't noticed yet, or if they hadn't said anything. Clara was good at hiding her struggles, plastering on a professional smile and keeping her head down. But inside, she felt like she was unraveling. At home, things weren't much better. The dishes piled up in the sink, laundry overflowed from the hamper, and unopened mail cluttered the kitchen counter. Even her beloved cat, Luna, seemed to sense her mood, curling up quietly beside her instead of meowing for attention. The breaking point. One Thursday evening, after yet another long and unproductive day, Clara sank onto her couch and stared at the dark TV screen. The silence in her apartment felt oppressive. She knew she should eat dinner or at least drink some water, but the effort seemed monumental. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a text from her younger sister, Emily. "Hey, haven't heard from you in a bit. Everything okay?" Clara's chest tightened. Emily had always been her rock, the one person she could count on for support. But even responding to her felt like too much. She set the phone down without replying, guilt gnawing at her. As the evening stretched into night, Clara felt the weight of her emotions pressing harder. Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden and unstoppable. She buried her face in her hands, the sobs shaking her body. She didn't know how long she sat there, but eventually, the tears subsided. A thought rose to the surface, clear and undeniable: I need help. Taking the first step. The next morning, Clara called her primary care physician and asked for a referral to a therapist. It felt like admitting defeat, but a small voice inside reminded her that seeking help was a step toward healing. Her first therapy session was both awkward and cathartic. Sitting across from Dr. Rivera in a softly lit office, Clara hesitated before speaking. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "Start wherever feels right," Dr. Rivera said gently. Clara began haltingly, talking about her job, the pressure to perform, and the growing sense of dread that followed her everywhere. She admitted to feeling like a failure, despite all evidence to the contrary. Dr. Rivera listened carefully, then said, "What you're describing sounds a lot like depression. It's not a reflection of your character or your abilities, it's a condition, one that we can work through together." The words were both terrifying and comforting. For the first time, Clara felt like someone understood what she was going through. Small changes. Dr. Rivera encouraged Clara to make small, manageable changes. One of the first was establishing a routine. "Start with something simple," she suggested. "Pick one thing you can do every day, no matter how small. Even brushing your teeth or making your bed can create a sense of accomplishment." Clara decided to start with walking Luna in the mornings. Luna had always been an indoor cat, but she loved the idea of harness training. The first few days felt like a chore, but as Clara watched Luna's cautious steps and curious sniffs of the outside world, she felt a flicker of joy. She also began journaling at Dr. Rivera's suggestion. At first, her entries were short and scattered, just a sentence or two about her day. But as the weeks passed, she found herself writing more, untangling her thoughts and emotions on the page. Opening up. One evening, Clara finally replied to Emily's text. "Hey, sorry for the silence. I've been dealing with some stuff. Can we talk?" Emily called almost immediately. "Of course," she said. "What's going on?" Clara hesitated but then told her sister everything: the struggles at work, the overwhelming exhaustion, the therapy sessions. "I just feel so lost," she admitted. Emily's voice was steady and warm. "Clara, I'm so glad you told me. You don't have to go through this alone. Whatever you need, I'm here." The conversation left Clara feeling lighter. She realized how much she had been carrying by herself and how much easier it was to share the load. Building momentum. As the weeks turned into months, Clara began to find her footing again. Therapy helped her understand the roots of her depression, the unrealistic expectations she placed on herself, the fear of disappointing others, the need to always be perfect. She also started setting boundaries at work, something she'd never done before. When Joel asked for an update on a project, she told him honestly that she needed more time. To her surprise, he was understanding. "Thanks for letting me know," he said. "We'll adjust the timeline." It was a small moment, but it gave Clara the confidence to advocate for herself. A new perspective. One Friday evening, Clara sat at her desk, putting the finishing touches on the quarterly forecast. The numbers lined up neatly, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She glanced at Luna, who was perched on the windowsill, watching the city lights. Clara smiled, feeling a quiet contentment. Her depression hadn't disappeared, there were still hard days, moments of doubt and fatigue. But she was learning to navigate them, to recognize the signs and reach out when she needed support. As she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, Clara realized something important: she wasn't broken. She was healing, one small step at a time. Chapter 6: The Weight of Shadows. Elena sighed as she walked through the glass doors of the office building, the sharp scent of industrial cleaner mingling with the faint aroma of coffee from the break room down the hall. It was Monday, her least favorite day of the week, and the gray November sky outside seemed determined to match her mood. For as long as she could remember, Elena had been described as the reliable one at work. She was a project coordinator for a mid-size marketing firm, known for her ability to juggle deadlines, calm irate clients, and navigate office politics with a practiced ease. But what her colleagues didn't see, what no one ever saw, was the quiet battle she fought within herself every day. Elena had been grappling with depression for years, though she didn't call it that at first. For a long time, she'd written off her struggles as just being stressed out or tired. But as the days turned into months and the months into years, she began to notice how the weight of it all never really lifted. It sat on her chest like a stone, pressing down even on the good days, making the act of simply getting out of bed feel monumental. She placed her bag on her desk, mechanically powering up her computer. The buzz of office life hummed around her, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low murmur of conversations, but it felt distant, as though she were observing it all from behind a thick pane of glass. Her inbox was already overflowing. A client had sent a snippy email over the weekend about a delayed campaign launch, and there were 3 back-to-back meetings on her calendar before lunch. Elena rubbed her temples, the familiar ache starting behind her eyes. "Morning, Elena," came a cheerful voice. It was Raj, her coworker from IT. He was holding a mug that proclaimed "World's Okayest Coder" in bold letters. "Morning," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Raj paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "You okay? You seem tired." Elena hesitated. Part of her wanted to brush it off with a quick "I'm fine," but the words felt heavy and dishonest in her throat. "Just a lot on my mind," she said finally, hoping that would be enough. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and wandered off toward the break room. Elena watched him go, a pang of guilt twisting in her stomach. It wasn't Raj's fault she felt this way. It wasn't anyone's fault. And yet, the thought of opening up to someone, to admit how lost she felt, was terrifying. By midday, the meetings were over, and Elena sat at her desk, staring blankly at her screen. Her lunch sat untouched beside her, the sandwich she'd hastily thrown together that morning now unappetizing. She felt hollow, like a shell of the person she used to be. A notification popped up in the corner of her screen. It was a calendar reminder: therapy session at 5:30 p.m. She'd started seeing a therapist 3 months ago, after her best friend, Marissa, had gently but firmly encouraged her to seek help. "You don't have to do this alone," Marissa had said. "There's no shame in asking for support." At first, the sessions had been awkward. Elena wasn't used to talking about her feelings, let alone to a stranger. But slowly, she'd started to open up. Her therapist, Dr. Romero, had a calm, reassuring presence, and she often reminded Elena that healing wasn't a straight line, it was a process, one that required patience and self-compassion. Still, there were days like today when the progress felt non-existent. Days when the shadows loomed too large, and the thought of facing them felt insurmountable. By the time 5:30 rolled around, Elena was drained. The commute to Dr. Romero's office was a blur, and she found herself sitting in the familiar beige armchair, staring at the patterned rug on the floor. "How are you feeling today?" Dr. Romero asked, her voice gentle. Elena shrugged. "Tired. Overwhelmed. Like I'm just existing. Going through the motions." Dr. Romero nodded. "That's a lot to carry. Have you been able to do any of the self-care activities we discussed last week?" Elena hesitated. Not really, she admitted. It's hard to find the energy. That's okay, Dr. Romero said. Sometimes, self-care isn't about doing something big. It's about the small things. Drinking a glass of water, taking a few deep breaths, even just sitting with your feelings instead of pushing them away. You don't have to do it all at once. The session continued, and by the end, Elena felt a small flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope, exactly, but maybe the possibility of it. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, Elena woke up before her alarm. The early light filtered through her curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. She lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the world waking up outside. She thought about what Dr. Romero had said about small steps. Maybe she couldn't fix everything today, but she could do one thing. Just one. She got out of bed and made herself a cup of tea, savoring the warmth of the mug in her hands. She opened the window a crack, letting the crisp autumn air fill the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough. At work, things were still chaotic, but Elena found herself approaching it with a slightly different perspective. She took a few deep breaths before responding to the client's email, crafting a calm and professional reply. She forced herself to step away from her desk during lunch, taking a short walk around the block instead of scrolling through her phone. When Raj stopped by her desk that afternoon, she thanked him for checking in the day before. He looked surprised but pleased. "Anytime," he said with a grin. "Seriously, if you ever need to talk, I'm here." As the weeks passed, Elena continued to take small steps. Some days were harder than others, and there were still moments when the shadows threatened to overwhelm her. But she reminded herself that she wasn't alone. She had her therapist, her friends, and even little acts of kindness from coworkers like Raj. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table journaling, a new habit she'd started at Dr. Romero's suggestion, Elena realized something. The weight she carried wasn't gone, but it felt lighter somehow. Manageable. She was beginning to see that healing wasn't about erasing the pain, but learning to live alongside it. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel proud of how far she'd come. And as she closed her journal and prepared for bed, she felt that flicker again, stronger this time, brighter. The possibility of hope. Chapter 7, Small Steps. Oliver. Oliver sat at his desk, the soft hum of his computer blending with the muffled chatter of his coworkers in the open-plan office. The spreadsheets on his screen blurred together, numbers and formulas losing their meaning. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but the fog in his mind refused to lift. Accounting had never been his dream job, but it paid the bills. Most days, it felt manageable. Today, it felt impossible. "Hey, Oliver," came a voice, startling him. He looked up to see Ava, his supervisor, standing by his desk with a gentle smile. "Everything okay? You've been staring at that same screen for a while." Oliver nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a bit tired. I'll get back on track." Ava hesitated, as though considering whether to press further, but eventually nodded and moved on. Oliver exhaled, his chest tightening. He hated these moments, when someone noticed the cracks in the facade he worked so hard to maintain. The truth was, Oliver had been struggling for months. Depression had crept into his life like a thief in the night, stealing his energy, his joy, and his motivation. At first, he had chalked it up to stress from work or the long hours spent alone in his small apartment. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, it became clear this was something deeper. After work, Oliver shuffled home through the crowded city streets, his shoulders hunched against the chill of the November evening. The neon lights of the shops and restaurants seemed to mock his gray mood. He passed by a cafe where a group of friends laughed over steaming mugs of coffee. The sound felt distant, like it was coming from another world. By the time he reached his apartment, he was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. He dropped his bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch. The TV remote sat untouched on the coffee table, but he didn't have the energy to turn it on. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, his mind swirling with a mix of self-doubt and numbness. "I can't keep doing this," he whispered to the empty room. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, Oliver woke to the shrill beep of his alarm. His body felt like lead, and the thought of another day at the office filled him with dread. He considered calling in sick, but he knew that would only add to the pile of work waiting for him. As he brushed his teeth, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his unshaven face made him look older than his 29 years. "Get it together," he muttered. But the words felt hollow. At work, he tried to focus on his tasks, but his mind kept drifting. He stared at an expense report, the numbers swimming before his eyes. The weight of his depression pressed down on him, making even the smallest tasks feel monumental. During lunch, Oliver sat alone in the break room, picking at a sandwich he didn't want. He watched as his coworkers chatted and laughed at a nearby table. A pang of envy stabbed at him. He wanted to join in, but the thought of making small talk felt overwhelming. "Hey, Oliver," said Sarah, a coworker he'd occasionally collaborated with. She pulled up a chair beside him. "You okay? You've been really quiet lately." Oliver hesitated, his instinct to brush her off warring with a desperate need to talk to someone. Finally, he said, "I've just been tired. It's been hard to keep up." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "I get that. Sometimes life just weighs on you, you know?" Her words caught him off guard. He hadn't expected understanding, let alone empathy. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been like that for a while." Sarah gave him a small smile. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. No pressure." That evening, Oliver sat on his couch, thinking about Sarah's words. He'd always kept his struggles to himself, afraid of being judged or dismissed. But her kindness had sparked something in him. A tiny flicker of hope. He opened his laptop and hesitated before typing how to deal with depression into the search bar. The results were overwhelming: articles, forums, videos. One link caught his eye: finding a therapist near you. He clicked on it, his heart pounding. He'd thought about therapy before, but had always found reasons to put it off. Too expensive. Too time-consuming. Too vulnerable. But as he scrolled through the list of therapists in his area, he realized he couldn't keep living like this. He jotted down the number of one who seemed approachable and specialized in depression and anxiety. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. The following week, Oliver found himself sitting in a cozy office, the walls lined with books and the faint scent of lavender in the air. Across from him sat Dr. Reyes, a warm-eyed therapist who listened intently as Oliver stumbled through his story. I don't know how to get out of this," he admitted, his voice cracking. "It's like I'm stuck in this black hole, and no matter what I do, I can't climb out." Dr. Reyes nodded. "It sounds like you've been carrying a heavy burden on your own. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. What we're going to do is work together to find ways to lighten that load." For the first time in months, Oliver felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't an immediate solution, but it was a start. As weeks turned into months, Oliver began to see small changes. Therapy helped him unpack the thoughts and feelings that had been weighing him down. He started journaling, which allowed him to process his emotions in a way he hadn't before. He also began taking short walks during his lunch breaks, finding solace in the rhythm of his footsteps and the fresh air. At work, he opened up to Ava about his struggles, and to his surprise, she was supportive. She adjusted his workload and encouraged him to take breaks when needed. Sarah, true to her word, became a quiet source of support, checking in with him from time to time. One evening, Oliver sat on his couch, his journal open on his lap. He wrote about his day, the small victories, the lingering challenges. He realized that while the fog hadn't completely lifted, it had started to thin. He could see glimmers of light breaking through. He closed the journal and looked out the window at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it didn't have to be. He was learning to find moments of peace and joy, even amidst the struggle. Small steps, he thought, smiling to himself. One at a time. Chapter 8, A Quiet Wait. Emily. The alarm blared its familiar tune, a shrill sound that cut through the early morning quiet. Emily groaned and reached for her phone, swiping the screen to silence it. She stared at the ceiling for a moment, her chest heavy with the weight she had carried for years. Another day at work, another day pretending she was fine. Emily was a graphic designer for a small marketing firm in the city. She loved the creative process, the way colors and shapes could convey emotions words never could. But lately, even her passion for design felt distant, buried under layers of exhaustion and apathy. Each project felt like a mountain she had to climb with no energy to scale it. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and sat for a moment, her hands resting on her thighs. The thought of calling in sick crossed her mind, but she dismissed it. She couldn't afford to lose her job. And besides, explaining why she needed a break felt impossible. How do you tell your boss you're fighting a battle they can't see? The office was a short subway ride away, but Emily dreaded it nonetheless. The crowded train, the forced small talk with colleagues, the pressure to churn out brilliant designs on tight deadlines, it all felt overwhelming. As she stepped onto the train, she put in her earbuds and turned up the volume, drowning out the world with a carefully curated playlist of soothing instrumental music. It helped, but only just. When she arrived at the office, Emily plastered a polite smile on her face, her practiced mask of normalcy. Her coworker, Lisa, waved from her desk. "Morning, Em. Ready for another day of brilliance?" Lisa said cheerily. Emily forced a chuckle. Always. Inside, she felt anything but ready. Her mind buzzed with the dozens of tasks she needed to complete, each one piling on top of the other until they blurred into an amorphous, unmanageable heap. She opened her laptop and stared at the screen, her cursor blinking in the empty design file. Her heart sank. Just start, she whispered to herself. But starting was the hardest part. Her mind, once brimming with ideas, felt like a barren landscape. She pushed herself, sketching shapes and colors that felt lifeless and uninspired. She knew she could do better, but the energy to try harder eluded her. Around noon, Lisa leaned over her desk. "Hey, a bunch of us are grabbing lunch at that new taco place. Wanna come?" Emily hesitated. She wanted to say yes, to be part of the group, to feel normal. But the thought of being surrounded by chatter, of keeping up her mask, was too much. "Thanks, but I brought my lunch today," she lied. "Maybe next time." Lisa nodded, her face kind but tinged with disappointment. As her coworkers left, the office grew quiet. Emily sighed, relieved to be alone. She pulled out her sandwich, taking small bites as she scrolled through social media on her phone. Everyone else seemed so vibrant, so full of life. Friends traveling the world, getting promotions, starting families. She felt like she was standing still while the world raced ahead. The afternoon dragged on. By 3 p.m., Emily's head throbbed from staring at the screen. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Crying felt like it might release some of the pressure inside her, but even that small relief was out of reach. When 5 p.m. finally arrived, Emily packed her things and headed home. The subway ride was a blur, her thoughts clouded by a fog of self-doubt and fatigue. At home, she changed into sweatpants and collapsed onto the couch. She stared at the TV, flipping through channels without settling on anything. The emptiness inside her felt vast, swallowing her whole. Emily's phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was her best friend, Rachel, calling. She hesitated, debating whether to answer. Finally, she picked up. "Hey," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Hey, Em. How was your day?" Rachel's voice was warm and familiar, a small comfort. "It was fine. Just busy, you know," Emily replied, her words automatic. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Emily, are you okay?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to say she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, her voice cracked, and she whispered, "I don't know." Rachel's tone softened. "Do you want to talk about it?" For the first time in weeks, Emily let herself be honest. She talked about the heaviness she felt every day, the way her job, something she once loved, had become a source of dread. She talked about how hard it was to get out of bed, to face the world, to even eat sometimes. Rachel listened without interrupting, her presence steady and reassuring. "I'm so sorry you're feeling this way," Rachel said when Emily finished. "But I'm glad you told me. You don't have to go through this alone." Emily felt a small flicker of relief. Sharing her struggles didn't fix everything, but it made her feel less alone. Rachel continued, "Have you thought about talking to a therapist? I think it could really help." Emily hesitated. The idea of opening up to a stranger was daunting, but she knew Rachel was right. She needed help. "I'll think about it," Emily said. "Good. And in the meantime, I'm here for you, okay? Anytime you need to talk." After they hung up, Emily felt a little lighter. The weight of her depression was still there, but it didn't feel as suffocating. She went to her bedroom and opened her laptop, searching for local therapists. The thought of reaching out was scary, but the alternative, continuing to live like this, was scarier. Over the next few weeks, Emily began therapy. It wasn't an instant fix, and some days were still incredibly hard. But having someone to talk to, someone who could help her navigate her emotions and develop coping strategies, made a difference. At work, she started setting small, manageable goals for herself. Completing one design, even if it wasn't perfect, was a victory. She also opened up to Lisa about how she'd been feeling, and Lisa responded with understanding and support. Slowly, Emily began to feel more like herself. There were still tough days, but there were good ones too. Days when she felt a spark of creativity, when she enjoyed lunch with her coworkers, when she laughed at something silly Lisa said. Depression was a part of her life, but it didn't define her. She was Emily, a talented designer, a loyal friend, a person who was learning to navigate the challenges of her mental health with courage and resilience. And that was enough. Chapter 9, A Quiet Morning, Nate. The alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., as it always did. Nate groaned, slapping at his phone until the shrill noise ceased. For a moment, he lay there, staring at the faint cracks in his ceiling. Another day. Another battle. Nate worked as a graphic designer for a mid-sized marketing agency, the kind of job he once thought he'd love. Creativity on demand, colorful campaigns, brainstorming with a team, it had seemed like a dream fresh out of college. But over time, the excitement faded. Deadlines loomed too large, clients became demanding, and the sparkle in his ideas dimmed under the weight of revisions and "can we make the logo bigger?" requests. His chest felt heavy as he thought about the day ahead. He needed to finish a pitch presentation, a project that had stalled for weeks because every time he sat down to work on it, his mind seemed to freeze. It wasn't that he didn't have ideas, he just couldn't summon the energy to make them real. Dragging himself out of bed, Nate shuffled into the bathroom. The mirror showed a face that hadn't smiled genuinely in weeks, dark circles under his brown eyes, stubble creeping along his jawline. He reached for his toothbrush, mechanically going through the motions. It felt like everything in his life had become like this, just motions, a script he was barely following. The office was quiet when he arrived. Nate liked getting in early before the chatter started, before he had to paste on a smile and exchange pleasantries with coworkers. He settled into his desk, opened his laptop, and stared at the blank PowerPoint slide in front of him. "Just start," he muttered to himself. "Anything is better than nothing." But the cursor blinked at him, tauntingly. The familiar knot in his stomach tightened, and his thoughts started to spiral. "You're useless. Everyone else is better at this than you. Why can't you just get it together?" He closed his eyes, trying to silence the voice, but it only grew louder. His hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to slam his laptop shut and walk out. Instead, he reached into his bag for his headphones, hoping some music might help. As he scrolled through his playlist, he caught sight of a sticky note taped to the corner of his monitor. His therapist had suggested he write small reminders to himself. This one read, "You're not your thoughts. Take it one step at a time." Nate took a deep breath. Okay, one step at a time. He added a title to the slide, then another line. Slowly, the layout began to take shape. By lunchtime, he had made decent progress, though it still felt like trudging through mud. He wandered into the break room, grabbing a lukewarm coffee and a granola bar from the counter. Liz, his coworker, was sitting at the small table scrolling through her phone. "Hey, Nate," she said, glancing up. "You okay? You've been quiet lately." He hesitated, debating whether to brush it off with a casual "yeah, just tired," like he usually did. But something in her tone felt genuine, not just polite office small talk. "I've been struggling," he admitted, avoiding her gaze. Liz set her phone down. "Do you want to talk about it?" Nate was surprised by the offer. Most people didn't ask twice, content with surface-level responses. He wasn't sure he wanted to dive into the mess inside his head, but the thought of someone listening felt oddly comforting. "It's hard to explain," he started. "Work feels overwhelming, but not just work. Everything does. I can't shake this heaviness." Liz nodded. "I get that. I went through something similar last year. It felt like I was carrying a weight I couldn't put down, no matter what I did." He looked at her, surprised again. Liz always seemed so upbeat, the kind of person who lit up a room. "Really?" "Yeah. I ended up seeing a therapist, and it helped a lot. But it wasn't easy. I had to learn to be kinder to myself, which sounds cheesy, but it's true." Nate let her words sink in. He'd been seeing a therapist for a few months now, but progress felt slow, like trying to move a boulder uphill. "Do you ever feel like you're just stuck?" he asked. "All the time," Liz said with a small smile. "But I remind myself that being stuck doesn't mean I'll never move again. It just means I need to figure out what's holding me in place." The afternoon passed in a blur. Nate finished the presentation and emailed it to his manager, relieved to check it off his list. But the weight in his chest didn't disappear. He knew it wouldn't, not yet, at least. When he got home, the apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He dropped his bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch. The temptation to scroll aimlessly on his phone was strong, but his therapist's voice echoed in his mind. "Try to do one thing each day that feels meaningful to you." Meaningful. The word felt foreign, but he decided to try. Pulling out his sketchbook, Nate flipped to a blank page. Drawing used to be his escape, a way to lose himself in something that felt pure and unpressured. He sketched aimlessly at first, letting the pencil glide across the page. Shapes turned into patterns, patterns into scenes. Before he knew it, an hour had passed, and the page was filled with a chaotic but oddly satisfying design. For the first time in days, Nate felt a flicker of something: pride? Joy? It was faint, but it was there. Over the next few weeks, he tried to hold on to that flicker. Some days were better than others. There were mornings when getting out of bed felt like an impossible task, and others where he found small moments of peace, whether it was in a cup of coffee, a conversation with Liz, or a quiet evening spent drawing. Work was still stressful, but Nate started setting boundaries, something he'd never dared to do before. When his manager asked if he could take on an additional project, he forced himself to say, "I don't think I have the capacity for that right now." The world didn't end. Liz checked in on him occasionally, and their conversations became a bright spot in his day. She reminded him that he wasn't alone, that it was okay to lean on others. One morning, as he walked to the office, Nate noticed the trees lining the street. Their leaves had turned golden, a brilliant reminder that seasons change. He paused, taking in the crisp air, the crunch of leaves under his shoes. It struck him that, while the heaviness was still there, it felt a little lighter. He was learning to carry it, learning to let himself hope. And for the first time in a long time, Nate thought, maybe I'll be okay. Chapter 10: Aubrey's Quiet Battle. Aubrey adjusted her glasses and stared at the glowing screen in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving, as her thoughts raced far away from the spreadsheet she was supposed to be editing. Numbers blurred into incomprehensible patterns, and the once familiar hum of the office felt foreign and suffocating. As a data analyst at a mid-sized marketing firm, Aubrey had always taken pride in her meticulous work. She loved numbers, the way they could tell a story when pieced together correctly. But lately, the passion she once felt had faded into a dull obligation. She glanced at the clock, 11:37 a.m. It was too early for lunch, but the thought of sitting through another unproductive hour felt unbearable. She minimized the spreadsheet and opened her email. A reminder flashed on the screen: Quarterly Team Review, 3 p.m. Her stomach tightened. It wasn't the meeting itself that unnerved her, it was the idea of sitting in a room full of colleagues, pretending she wasn't unraveling inside. Aubrey had always been good at pretending. The depression had crept in quietly, like a shadow stretching unnoticed at dusk. At first, it was just fatigue. "I'm just tired," she'd tell herself, blaming long hours at work or a disrupted sleep schedule. But soon, mornings became battles against gravity, the weight of the world pressing her back into bed. Tasks she once handled with ease, as making coffee, replying to a text, folding laundry, now felt insurmountable. Her closest friend, Emily, had noticed the change. "You've been so quiet lately," she'd said during their last lunch outing. "Is everything okay?" Aubrey had forced a smile. "Just busy with work," she'd lied, stirring her iced tea until the ice melted. In truth, she didn't know how to explain the emptiness she felt. How could she articulate something so intangible? Depression didn't have a single cause, and for Aubrey, it felt like a storm of small disappointments, insecurities, and unspoken fears, all colliding at once. At 12:15, Aubrey finally stepped away from her desk and headed to the break room. She poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee and stared out the window. The world outside seemed to be moving at a pace she couldn't match, people rushing down the street, cars honking, the distant sound of construction. "Aubrey, you okay?" She turned to see Marcus, her colleague, leaning against the counter. He was holding a sandwich in one hand and a water bottle in the other, his brow furrowed with concern. "Yeah," she said too quickly. "Just tired." Marcus nodded but didn't look convinced. "If you ever want to talk, I'm around," he said, his voice kind but unobtrusive. "Thanks," she mumbled, grateful and embarrassed all at once. When the meeting rolled around, Aubrey felt the familiar twinge of anxiety. She sat at the far end of the conference table, hoping to go unnoticed. As her manager, Teresa, outlined the team's goals for the next quarter, Aubrey focused on her notebook, doodling patterns in the margins. Aubrey, any updates on the campaign analytics? Teresa's voice cut through her thoughts. Aubrey's heart raced. She swallowed hard and forced a smile. I'm finalizing the report and will send it out tomorrow, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Teresa nodded and moved on, but Aubrey could feel her cheeks burning. She hadn't even started the report. That evening, Aubrey sat on her couch, her laptop balanced on her knees. She opened the campaign data file and stared at it, willing herself to start. But the numbers felt heavy, each one a reminder of her perceived inadequacy. Her phone buzzed beside her, a text from Emily. Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Want to grab dinner this weekend? Aubrey sighed. The thought of socializing felt exhausting, but she knew she couldn't keep pushing people away. She typed a quick reply, sure. Saturday? Saturday came faster than expected. Aubrey met Emily at their favorite diner, a cozy spot with checkered tablecloths and warm lighting. You look good, Emily said as they settled into their booth. Aubrey laughed softly. Thanks. You, too. They chatted about work, mutual friends, and an upcoming concert Emily was excited about. For a moment, Aubrey felt almost normal, the heaviness in her chest lifting slightly. Seriously, though, Emily said, her tone shifting. How are you? Really? Aubrey hesitated, her instinct to deflect clashing with the desire to be honest. She took a deep breath. I've been struggling, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I'm here for you, you know that, right? Tears welled up in Aubrey's eyes. She nodded, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. The next week, Aubrey decided to take a small step. During her lunch break, she looked up local therapists and made an appointment. It felt daunting, but she reminded herself that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness. When the day of her first session arrived, Aubrey felt a mix of anxiety and hope. She sat in the therapist's cozy office, the scent of lavender filling the air, and talked about everything she'd been carrying. It sounds like you've been holding a lot inside, the therapist said gently. We'll work on unpacking it, one piece at a time. For the first time in months, Aubrey felt a flicker of relief. She wasn't alone in this. Over the next few weeks, Aubrey began to feel small shifts. Therapy became a safe space where she could confront her fears and learn new ways to cope. She started journaling in the evenings, pouring her thoughts onto paper instead of letting them spiral in her mind. Work was still challenging, but she set boundaries, taking breaks when she needed them and being honest with her manager about feeling overwhelmed. To her surprise, Teresa was understanding, even suggesting Aubrey take a few mental health days to recharge. Outside of work, Aubrey reconnected with old hobbies. She dusted off her sketchbook and spent quiet evenings drawing, letting her creativity flow without judgment. One afternoon, as she walked home from the office, Aubrey noticed the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns on the sidewalk. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a reminder that beauty still existed, even in the midst of struggle. She wasn't cured. Depression wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, or maybe ever entirely. But Aubrey was learning to live with it, to face each day with a little more grace and compassion for herself. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 11, A Journey Through Depression. Jenna. Jenna stared at her computer screen, the blinking cursor a taunting reminder of the words she needed to write. As a content editor for a small publishing house, she was supposed to love her job. In the beginning, she had the flow of creativity, the satisfaction of seeing a polished piece ready for publication, the camaraderie with her team, all of it had once brought her joy. But now, every task felt like wading through quicksand. It wasn't just work. Over the past year, Jenna had felt her world grow heavier, darker. She had chalked it up to stress at first, deadlines, financial worries, and the isolation brought on by working from home. But deep down, she knew this was something more. A heaviness had settled in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Simple tasks like making her bed or answering an email felt monumental. She found herself avoiding friends, dodging calls, and sinking deeper into her own mind. It was another gray morning when Jenna finally admitted to herself that she needed help. She was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at a half-empty coffee cup, her laptop closed and untouched. Her inbox was overflowing with unanswered messages, and her editor had sent a gentle nudge about a project due the following week. The thought of even opening the email made her stomach churn. Her cat, Milo, jumped onto the table, his soft purr breaking the silence. He nudged her arm, demanding attention. Jenna reached out absently to scratch his ears, tears pricking her eyes. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she whispered, her voice cracking. Later that day, Jenna called her best friend, Alyssa. It took her an hour to work up the courage, and when Alyssa answered, the words spilled out in a rush. "I'm not okay. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel lost. Like I'm drowning and I can't get out." Alyssa listened quietly, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "I'm so sorry you're feeling this way, Jenna. I'm here for you, and I think it's really brave of you to talk about it. Have you thought about seeing a therapist?" The suggestion wasn't new, Jenna had considered it before. But actually taking that step felt like a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. Alyssa, sensing her hesitation, offered to help her look for someone and even suggested a few options. "Just take it one step at a time," she said. "You don't have to do this alone." 2 weeks later, Jenna sat in a small, cozy office with a therapist named Dr. Ellis. The room was decorated with warm colors and soft lighting, designed to put clients at ease. Jenna clutched a tissue in her hand, feeling vulnerable but strangely relieved. For the first time in months, she felt like she could let down the walls she had built around herself. Dr. Ellis's questions were gentle but probing, encouraging Jenna to explore the roots of her feelings. They talked about her perfectionism, the pressure she put on herself at work, and how she often felt like she wasn't good enough, despite evidence to the contrary. They also discussed the isolation she had been experiencing and how it had amplified her struggles. "You've been carrying a lot," Dr. Ellis said at one point. "It's no wonder you feel exhausted. But the fact that you're here, willing to talk about it, shows immense strength." Jenna felt a small spark of hope. Maybe this was the first step toward finding herself again. As the weeks turned into months, Jenna began to see glimmers of light in the darkness. Therapy wasn't easy. Some sessions left her emotionally drained, forcing her to confront feelings she had buried for years. But it also brought moments of clarity and self-compassion. She started making small changes in her daily routine. Instead of staying up late scrolling on her phone, she made an effort to go to bed earlier and wake up at a consistent time. She began journaling in the mornings, pouring out her thoughts onto the page without judgment. It was messy and raw, but it felt freeing. Work was still a challenge, but Jenna decided to be honest with her boss, Rachel. One afternoon, she sent Rachel an email requesting a one-on-one meeting. The thought of explaining her struggles made her palms sweat, but she knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. During their meeting, Jenna took a deep breath and said, "I've been struggling with my mental health lately, and it's been affecting my productivity. I'm working on it, and I've started seeing a therapist, but I wanted to let you know in case it seems like I'm not as present as I used to be." Rachel's response surprised her. "Thank you for sharing that, Jenna. I know it takes courage to talk about these things. I've noticed you've seemed overwhelmed, and I'm glad you're taking steps to care for yourself. Let's figure out how we can support you." Together, they adjusted Jenna's workload, setting more realistic deadlines and prioritizing tasks. Rachel also encouraged her to take mental health days when needed. The conversation lifted a weight off Jenna's shoulders, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. One weekend, Jenna decided to join a local hiking group. She had always loved nature but hadn't ventured outside much since her depression took hold. The first hike was daunting. She was nervous about meeting new people and unsure if she'd have the energy to keep up. But as she reached the summit of a small hill and looked out at the sprawling landscape, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in ages. The hikes became a regular part of her routine, a way to reconnect with the world and herself. She found solace in the rhythm of her footsteps, the rustle of leaves, and the camaraderie of her fellow hikers. Slowly, the fog in her mind began to lift. By the end of the year, Jenna wasn't cured. She knew depression wasn't something that disappeared overnight. But she had learned how to manage it, to recognize the signs and take action before the darkness consumed her. Therapy continued to be a cornerstone of her recovery, as did the small habits she had cultivated: journaling, hiking, and reaching out to friends instead of retreating into isolation. At work, she felt more confident and capable. The passion for her job had started to return, and she found herself enjoying the process of editing again. She even began mentoring a junior editor, sharing the lessons she had learned about balancing work and mental health. One evening, as Jenna sat on her balcony with Milo curled up beside her, she reflected on how far she had come. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but she no longer felt like she was facing it alone. She had built a support system, both within herself and with the people around her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The journey through depression had taught her that healing wasn't about erasing the pain, but learning to carry it with grace and strength. And in doing so, Jenna discovered a resilience she never knew she had. As we conclude these 12 deeply personal and courageous stories, let them serve as a reminder that every struggle is unique, but no one needs to face it alone. Depression is a journey, often filled with challenges, but also with moments of hope, resilience, and growth. If these stories resonated with you, know that it's okay to reach out, to share your truth, and to seek support. Healing takes time, but each step forward, no matter how small, is a triumph. Together, we can break the silence, build understanding, and create a world where no one feels invisible in their struggle. Thank you for listening.